Hey everybody, welcome back. Thanks for stopping in at the Red Barn to check in on progress on this thing behind me, the Ferrari 360 swap Porsche 914. We're making good progress and I got a handful of things left before I try to fire this for the first time. And I think at the end of this episode, you're probably all going to have the same question. And that question is, why are you doing this to yourself? And before I jump back into the wiring, I wanted to address a couple questions that came up from the last episode. One was what I thought was a really interesting question and something I addressed long ago, but I keep forgetting. Many of you haven't watched every episode, and some of you are brand new to the channel. So the question was, could I have used the Ferrari engine wiring harness, and why did I have to do something exotic like a custom loom and the Haltech and all that other stuff? I could have used the engine harness. Those of you that are aware of Home Built by Jeff, his channel, he used this same motor in an old Alpha, and he ended up using the factory wiring harness, chopped it off essentially, and then mapped the wires to a link ECU to get it running in his car. So I could have used the wiring harness. I also could have used the ECUs, and I say ECUs plural. Some of you know this, some of you might not know this. The Ferrari 360, they actually run these things as two separate four-cylinder engines. So there's two of everything. There's two ECUs, there's two crank position sensors, there's two cam position sensors, four knock sensors, two fuel pumps. You can see here I've gotten a little plug, but there's the cam position sensor for this side. And if you look down in there, you can see the same little plug. That's the crank position sensor for this side, this bank of cylinders. And if I bring you around here, I'm running my sensors on this side. This is cylinder 1, 2, 3, 4. That's cylinder 5, 6, 7, 8. But there's my cam position sensor that I will be using, and there's my crank position sensor that I will be using. And as you know, I'm just going to have a single fuel pump, that runs up through that fuel pressure regulator. So I could have used the factory ECUs and the factory harness. A little more information that you may find interesting or you may find not interesting is there's a guy in the UK, I'm pretty sure, this goes back a year plus at this point, 360 Trev, I think is his username on Ferrari chat. And he's got like the world's coolest 360. It's like mostly challenged Stradali'd. It's a super duper awesome car. Anyway, he has cracked the code and has hacked the Ferrari ECUs. And I had a phone call with him, a WhatsApp video walk around about this car. And he said, hey, I could reprogram those ECUs and you could run the factory ECUs. So that was where I was going in the beginning. But Trev's got a life outside of helping me get my car going. And to be perfectly frank, I didn't want to have one dude in the entire world that I was dependent on to get the car running, debug things. He's in Europe. I can only imagine, hey, I've got something that's not quite right. How long is that cycle going to take to go through? Certainly not saying he couldn't have done it or wouldn't have done it, but I just opted for, I'm going with a bespoke wiring harness and an ECU that has, support from dozens and dozens of people. There's tuners that know all about them. The Haltech support is awesome. But yeah, I think that's a great question. It's a bunch more work, if you will, but I think I'm going to end up with something that's more reliable, more programmable, and the stuff that I haven't even gotten to, like this ECU supports cruise control. It supports being able to drive a digital dash as well as analog gauges at the same time. It supports a bunch of data logging. It's a much more modern, upgradable, that whole thing. So I am happy with that decision, and famous last words, it's really not a complicated engine. It doesn't have scary, variable valve timing. It's got a on-off valve timing capability, as you know. It's got this variable intake length setup and the flapper valve. Both of those are on or off, so there's no fancy programming necessary. And in all, the Haltech should be more than capable of getting this thing running and doing all kinds of other cool stuff. And then heaven forbid one of those ECUs takes a dump. They're expensive if you can even find one. So all that stuff added up to me thinking, I'm just going with an aftermarket ECU and I'll build my own wiring harness and then I'm responsible for everything. And I've got a gigantic I've got a big company and a tuner community behind me that I think is going to make this a much more reliable way to go in the long run. So thanks for that question, and now let's get back to the build. One of the other comments I got in the last episode is, could you talk more about the tools you use when you're doing your wiring and explain something about the tools? If you notice some background noise, we are getting the first real storm of the year here, and as you know, the Red Barn has a metal roof, so it gets a little bit noisy sometimes, so pardon me for that. Anyway, this is the starter cable that is going to run from the battery to the starter, and I'm going to use a 4 AWG wire. AWG is American Wire Gauge, and it's pretty standard for starters, and this motor's not, you know, some giant high compression thing, so this should be just fine. Very fine wire, lots and lots of strands, and I have determined that I need a 45-degree terminal coming out, and you'll see when I go to put the starter cable on the car. But I'm going to go ahead and crimp this terminal onto the starter cable, so with that fit on there. And the tool I'm going to use is one of these hydraulic crimpers. And Harbor Freight makes these, and they work pretty well, but they have at least the one I got had, when I got it, had a limited size of dies. And this is a Temco. I got this off Amazon. They're not cheap, but they're not super expensive. I think it was like $150, $160, something like that. But it comes with a whole bunch of different size dies. Great little crimper. And since this is the first end of the terminal, and I know I want it to be positioned in a certain way on the car, it doesn't matter where, how I position this rotation-wise on the cable, but when I get to the other end, I need to have this on the car and make sure that because there's going to be a positional thing where this thing goes onto one of the lugs for the power coming off the battery. So a little helpful hint, don't worry about the position of your first one, worry about the position of your second one in terms of if there's a rotation or a twist that you need to preserve, because these cables are pretty thick and they do not like to just twist. Anyway, with that done, and with my 4 AWG jaws in here, I am now going to go ahead and crimp this. And you can see it's a 6-sided crimper, and the amount that it crimps and all that good stuff is important to getting a good solid crimp on your terminal. So let me go ahead and do this crimp now. And now it's crimp this thing down. And the nice thing about it is you can see that the jaws are going to come together as I'm crimping. And when the jaws are done, that crimp is made. And there's my nice tidy little crimp. And so now I'll heat shrink this and I will be all done with the starter end of this cable. And then I was a quick trip over to the heat gun and I used a section of SCL, and you can also see it's glue lined. So this is a completely sealed heat shrunk crimped joint and super tidy. And now that's ready to go on the car on the starter end. Crimp, 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 crimp. Okay, so now routing this starter cable, if I show you where it attaches under the car, I've got some things pulled out of the way, but here's the main lug and here's the exhaust pipe. So I've got plenty of room in terms of heat, and this is just loose so I can play with where it's going. And it just does a quick U-turn, which is why I wanted this to be a 45, right? I got to get it pointed in that general direction. So it comes out, let me take you up top. All right, and here you can see, right, it comes out here, nice and relaxed. And I figure if I use some P-clamps on these differential mounts, right, I can just clip it in, essentially, keep it well clear of the CV joint. And then if you look at it from over here, You can see it's going to come up. I can attach it to the bottom of this crossbar. It'll come all the way across to the top of the longitudinal and then run down the longitudinal. And remember, the battery is going to be like right there, and it can go right onto the battery post. I think this works out better, routing it along the top of everything than trying to thread it through from underneath. There's a bunch of things that could get hung up on. I'd prefer not to have stuff like that where it could have any possibility of snagging something that I drive over. And I think this will be pretty tidy and mostly out of the way. So I always reserve the right to change my mind, but I think this is the direction I'm going. And so, yeah, now I got to work out a battery ground to the chassis and something back to the drivetrain. So I'll get going on that too. Okay, true confessions about this build. I want to get the car running first and foremost. And there's a whole bunch of stuff I've been holding off on about buying for the car. I'll talk about all that stuff when I get to it. But what I want to do is make it run. And one of the questions that got asked earlier was, are you going to do anything for chassis stiffening? And the answer is yes, this thing's going to need something. As you know, probably can't tell, but yeah, it's hard to see. That longitudinal and this longitudinal have had a stiffening panel put over it. What I'm also going to do is I am going to do, not unlike I did in the LS car, I'm going to build a center tunnel that is going to replace this shifter block, among other things. And that means I'm probably going to remove the factory tunnel and do a tubular structure, probably rectangular tubing, to create, let's call it a third longitudinal down the center of the car, which will help stiffen the chassis a bunch. And it'll give me a platform that the shifter can sit on. I can house all of the brake lines, the clutch line, the wiring, and all that stuff is way easier to get to. You can see how much fun it is when you get back into here to try to manage the all the tubes. You can see I've got stuff down in here. And so I'll have an open structure that I can build to with a removable cover that'll serve as the element that gets upholstered. But I don't want to cut the center tunnel out of this thing. I don't want to get distracted by building structure. I don't want to have to finalize all that design stuff. What that means is I am not going to try to finalize the wiring, the physical wiring, harness, and positions of all the components. I mentioned that a little bit earlier on, that this was going to kind of be a mess. Well, it's going to be a real mess, because what I've decided to do is, oops, I'm not even sure where I want to put this yet, because if I have a center console structure, I might be able to hide the power management unit inside of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take things like the power to the PDM, and I'm simply going to, I know it's not going to be farther away than this would take it. So I'm going to go ahead and I am going to crimp that thing onto it. And then this is the CAN connection back to the ECU. This is the CAN connection for the power management unit. And I'm just going to go ahead and put the connector right here at the full length. And so there's going to be a whole bunch of extra length wires inside the car just to get it to run. Once it's running and I'm comfortable, again, going all in, then I'm going to worry about remounting all this stuff, because the car is way far away from driving. I don't have brakes yet. I don't have calipers. I do have some wheels though, but you're gonna have to wait and see what I got. There's just a bunch, you know, I got a 914/6 steering column, an ignition switch, left-hand side. I got to wire all that stuff in. And as I said, for right now, I'm just going to try to make the car run. So I'm going to probably have the ignition switch flopping around on the ground. Again, I really want to prove out this motor. So that's my long-winded way around to saying this is going to be a nightmare of just stuff lying inside the car to get it to run. So let me go back to the earlier question where somebody said, show us about all these tools you use, the wiring tools, and let's go through that as I pin on these terminals and wire up the other end of this CAN connection. And a lot of this is going to be repetitive for those of you who've been following the channel. I've already gone ahead and gotten length set up on these, and I just treated myself to these new wire snippers. These are Nipex, and I can tell you that the very first time I used them was about 2 seconds ago when I trimmed these to length, and they are noticeably better than the stuff I've been using. Having a good pair of wire snips is super important and helpful. And now that I've got this set of wires to length, I now need to strip them. And this is an Ideal Strip Master. This is not their super high-end Ergo version, but it does all the stuff I need it to do. And some of the handy things that it does, most handy, is it's got this wire stop on it. So once you determine how much insulation you need to trim off, you can set this to the right length, and it's repeatable, right? So if you're pinning the same kind of connector and you're cutting all the wires and stripping all the wires, it just makes it no guesswork. You get the right length of insulation removed each time and all that good stuff. And then this is probably going to be hard to see, but you can see how these things work. First of all, there's jaws here that support stripping different size wires, all the different size wires, and they're labeled, if you can see that. And here's how it works, right? You put the wire in there with the insulation being grabbed by the jaws on the left, and the cutters are the jaws on the right. And when this thing comes down, it first starts to slice through the insulation, and then this vise kind of comes down and grabs the wire, and then as you finalize the squeeze, it just pulls the insulation off the end of the wire, right? So it's a really good, very repetitive, or very repeatable way to strip insulation. And with the jaws being sized the way they are, you don't cut into the conductor strands or any of that stuff. All right, and then I'm using a Deutsch connector. This is a DTM, as you saw last time, a DT Mini. So let's get this wire measured up to determine how much insulation we need to strip off. And one of the ways to do that is to realize that the end of this little bump, going to be real hard to see probably, but the end of that section of the terminal is where the wire goes in. And again, hard to see, but there's a little inspection hole. And what I try to do is eyeball about how much space that takes. And now thankfully I've got a billion different wires sitting in here, all of which are too long. And so with that set up, I'm going to take one of the wires I'm not actually pinning, and I'm going to do a test strip. And then I'm going to put the terminal on there, and you can see with the conductor bottomed out inside that section of the terminal, I can see it. I can visually see it through that inspection hole. And I can also see that I've got a little bit of a gap between the insulation and the terminal. So I know that that is the right length. So I was able to eyeball that adjustment the first time. I love it when that happens. So I'm going to make sure I don't lose where my terminal is. And I'm going to move on to the magic tool of all times. This is a DMC AF8 crimping tool. And this is one that's got an adjustable, this is called a turret, and it's adjustable for 3 different size terminals. And I happen to be working with number 20s, but this also does 16s and 12s. And with this set for number 20, you just rotate it to the size you want, and then lock that down into the turret housing. There's also a setting down here, which is important, because what this thing does, it's difficult to see without taking the turret off of it, but there are 8 little jaws in here, and all of these settings come together to control where those jaws are, how far in they come. So bigger terminals, they don't need to come in as far. Smaller terminals, they need to come in farther. Bigger terminals, they need to be positioned differently up and down, and that's what everything in here and here does. So with that all set up for a number 20, or excuse me, yes, a 20 terminal, I can now go to my real wires and strip them. And because I know that I've got my adjustment set up correctly, I can just go through here and go strip, 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 strip. Make sure you get your wire in the right place. You put it in too small of the hole and it'll take some of the conductor with it. But with all those ready to go, And now, take one of my terminals, place it on, always verify, visualize the conductor through the inspection hole, verify that the gap is still visible, always double check that you're on the right settings, and then in this goes to this end of the tool, and it bottoms out in here. And then it's a single cycle tool, and what that means is you don't have to guess how hard to squeeze, you just run it through its cycle. And best practice is always give it a tug test to make sure that that crimp is good and solid. And then it's rinse and repeat, as they say. The old eyeballs aren't what they used to be, and so making sure you've got all the strands of your conductor inside that terminal before you crimp it. There are all my wires. Terminals all crimped and ready to go. Again, tug test to make sure everybody's happy. And we already did the black one, so we know we're good. So that's nearly done. Then there is a locking component, which is this little piece. And that little wedgy thing slides down in here and forces the clips that hold those terminals. It prevents them from being moved inward to releasing those terminals. So once this is clicked in, just like that, I have a CAN connection. Now, you might say, why didn't you sheathe that wire? And it goes back to what I said earlier. I don't know how long this thing's going to actually need to be, so I'm not going to go ahead and heat shrink it. I'm just going to leave this messy, messy wire sitting in here like this. But now I can pin this into, or rather plug this into. This is the harness. This is the harness that plugs into the power management unit. And here's the CAN connection. And you can see, other than the fact that I used a green wire, and this one's a blue with a white stripe, right? It's pink, colored, white, and black. And now I've got my CAN connection ready to be hooked up to the power management unit. So there you go. A little bit later on, and I've done just a very little bit of wire routing, just to make sure I'm accounting for the circuits that have to go to the front of the car. Most of these stay inside the car, and it's things like the gauges, the ignition, turn signals, controls, wiper controls, and the like. And then some of these wires are going to have to route through and up to the front of the car for powering like the headlights, the horn, the turn signals, and things like that. So, but the good news is you can see as it starts to get a little bit organized, even though it's not sheathed, it's a lot tidier and not as intimidating as it once was. And now that I'm, getting down to like trying to see where everything's going to actually be, I'm starting to rethink not pulling that factory tunnel out of there, because I have to do things like account for a brake pressure switch and a clutch pressure switch. That'll be a lot easier to do if I have access to building those pressure switch locations inside my own tunnel structure versus, as you can see, trying to figure out where I might be able to tap into those hydraulic lines. But the big news would be, I think I'm going to pull that factory tunnel out, even if I don't build something yet, because it's just going to simplify where the wires can go, where the PDM can go, where those pressure switches can go. And yes, it's going to slow me down a little bit, but I really don't want to go backwards too far. So with the progress made for this week, I'm going to call it and say thank you very much for watching. And as always, please like, share, subscribe, and tell all your friends. And we will talk to everybody again real soon. Y'all take care. Bye-bye.